There's a lot of different enemy traits in the Battle Cats. Red, Floating, Black, Angel, Metal, Alien, Zombie, Aku, Relic, and Traitless are all important parts of enemies that help define their functions. Subtraits like Behemoth, Colossus, and Sage also give special attention to certain enemies. Today, we'll be looking at all of them from an analytical standpoint, explaining what they do, how they fit in the bigger picture of the game, and whether or not they succeed at being a good addition to the game. We'll also be ranking them in a tier list by how well they were implemented, just for a bit of extra fun. Also note that this is mostly ranking the traits regarding their regular enemies, so special event enemies or one-time bosses have less of an impact. Without further ado, let's begin. Red is the first trait that the player learns about while playing the game. First appearing in Maldives, the enemy Piggy is colored red, different from the previous white enemies the player has seen. Units like Axe and Fish Cat are listed as strong against red, so the player can use and figure out how traits and abilities work. The purpose of red enemies is to teach players about the trait system, and incentivize players to utilize it for success. Many red enemies, like Berserkori, Cappy, Professor A, Red Energy, and more, are a nuisance to deal with unless you use their proper counters, and this is by design. Even as far back as Empire of Cats Chapter 2, Nyandam and the One Horns in the stage are both red, meaning that using whale cats against them is both strong and the key to success. Red enemies typically have lower knockback counts compared to other traits and have a lot of HP. This sturdy nature usually calls for cat units with the strong or massive damage abilities to DPS them down, or crowd control to keep them back. I think red does a good job at being the fundamental trait that you're meant to counter, but there's not much else that it has going for it. Red has a pretty usual cast of enemies with different roles, some of which are more fun to deal with and others which are annoying or too oppressive, like Red Energy. From a visual standpoint, it doesn't exactly make sense why some of these enemies are red, it just seems to be that way because Ponos felt like it. Overall, it's a pretty good trait, and I'll put it in the middle of our list to start it off. Floating is the next trait introduced, and unlike most traits which are signified by color, floating is a trait categorized by enemies that fly or float, such as birds, bugs, and other flying creatures in the game. Floating enemies typically sport polar extremes when it comes to stats. They usually have a ton of knockbacks, like Bun Bun and Brawlo, or very few, like the Face, Muth, and Owlbro. Floating is also the first trait to introduce mixed traded enemies, like the red and floating JK Bun Bun in Stories of Legend, or the alien and floating I Am Face in Into the Future. Floating is usually given to enemies for thematic reasons, but also opens up more counterplay options. Units like Cameraman, Fishman, and Octo are stables for answering them, as well as many Ubers, and without these options fighting them can be quite a nuisance. Modern No Gacha is known to have very little floating counters, and this is why stages like 1+2 = Tor are infamously hard, while not difficult in a normal playthrough. While I do like a lot of floating enemies that exist, like Brawlo, Lil Bun Bun, and Owlbro, I do think the trait suffers from having a lack of role diversity. Many of the floating enemies are pretty similar in role, like Muth and Owlbro, as well as Bun Bun variants, and frontline aggressive peons like Brawlo variants. There seems to be a lack of LD support, aggressive frontline enemies with more HP than peons, as well as a few other types of enemies. But overall, I do think it's a pretty good trait regardless, and a great addition to having multi-traded enemies in the game. I'll be placing it in B, next to red, due to its positives and negatives. Black is a very common trait that defines its enemies with red eyes and pitch black on everything else. They usually have a high amount of knockbacks, and are fast and aggressive. Black enemies are known for their damage, usually high DPS burst attackers like Shadow Boxer K and Gory Black, or strong single hits like Lenoir or Kurosawa. They also tend to have lower amounts of HP compared to other traits. Black enemies follow a simple principle. They can destroy you easily, but you can destroy them easily. When left unchecked, a single Shadow Boxer K can destroy your attackers or Ubers in a matter of seconds. But there are many ways to beat him. You can juggle him with multiple attackers, nuke him with units like Pizza or massive damage Ubers, or even freeze with Bomber Cat or other crowd control. Black enemies have many counters in the game, and it's not rare to see people call them the easiest or the most power crap trait. But even though this is the case, black enemies still function at their job, because they aren't meant to be some overpowered enemies that can make you lose easily. Black enemies are fantastic for demanding an immediate response from the player, and whether that response is something simple, like deploying Pizza Cat, adding small amounts of pressure is something that's very important for balancing stages. This is why you see so many black peons or small support enemies in stages, like Doge Dark, Gory Black, SBK, Raging Gory, and more. Because even though these enemies are very simple to beat, they add depth to the stages they are in. Not to mention that the black trait has a lot of diversity when it comes to role coverage. Tacky is a fantastic LD enemy, Toucan has dangerous wave pressure, and Lenore is a pretty well balanced backliner. You have a black enemy for almost every role, and their nature of being easy to kill makes them not overbearing when used in stages. Although there are enemies like Razorback, almost every trait has one or more enemies that are completely terrible to fight without proper trait counters. In summary, black enemies still fundamentally work even when power crapped, and are some of the most important enemies in the game. Easy S tier. Angel enemies are defined with their signature halo and themes of holiness and wings. A gimmick the trait has is that they can't be floating enemies, as said by the Angel fanboy, with exception to the variety bears. Angel enemies are similar in ways to black enemies. They tend to be stronger and more aggressive versions of existing enemies, but they also tend to have a large amount of health. Angels usually also utilize more crowd control abilities than black enemies do. Sleipnir has knockback, Sunfish has slow, Wind Piggy has weaken, and so on. Angel enemies have a pretty infamous history in the game as being some of the hardest, from starred Angelic Gories to Winged Piggy, and even now enemies like Saint Dober. While it does make sense for them to be harder than normal enemies, I think Angels take it a bit too far. You may have heard that Angel enemies are balanced around Ramen Cat, as after the release of Ramen, many insanely hard Angel enemies would come out that are extremely difficult to handle without the usage of this anti-Angel meat shield. This is where my opinion of the Angel trait starts to differ from that of Black. Angel enemies are simply too overbearing. So many of them are terrible to fight without direct trait counters that it's just annoying and not fun to play into them. Their high health also makes bursting pretty much a non-option without direct trait counters, decreasing possible counter options. And that's where I think Angel enemies went wrong. Unlike most traits, where the enemies are mostly fair to handle with your regular generalists, Angel enemies demand attention for so many of them that it doesn't incentivize creative use of strategy, but rather cookie cutter bringing A to counter B, which gets repetitive and boring in the long term. For that reason, I'll be placing Angel in the C tier. It definitely still has a place in the game, but I do think that the execution of Angel enemies wasn't as good as many of the other traits. Metal is a robotic-themed trait that works entirely differently from all other traits in the game. Instead of receiving damage normally, metal enemies all take 1 damage from all sources, except critical hits, which bypass the metal effect and do full critical hit or double damage. This ability makes metals a very unique trait, and they play unlike any other one. While crowd control abilities still work as normal, doing damage is forced through the critical hit ability. In Update 13.3, Metal Killer was added, which causes attacks to bypass the metal ability and instead do % current health damage. Because of how restrictive they are, Metal has notably less enemies than other traits. While diversity is low, the bigger problem of metal enemies is just how they are extremely specific and cookie cutter to answer. Without either critical hit or metal killer ability, you won't be doing enough damage to kill anything that isn't just a metal peon, and enemies like Super Metal Hippo or Sir Metal Seal will basically be invincible. Only a couple of units in the game have the abilities required to handle metal enemies, and most of the ones that are this capable do not have good stats or usages against other enemies, making metals a super linear gameplay mechanic. You either bring the critical hit or metal killers to the metal enemies, or you simply lose. Not to mention, most critical hit and metal crowd control units have the ability set at a low chance of happening. This makes metals an inherent RNG trait to fight against, which is another downside of the trait. Although there are some RNG-free metal answers, like Soba and Crazed Monaco, they won't always be enough if the stage spams metal enemies. Metal Doge in particular is one of the worst enemies ever designed when at higher magnifications, because its health is too high to be killed reliably from rapid hits, and they are spammed in very large groups, meaning your only way to answer them is with RNG-based area attack critical hit units like Catornado or Cameraman. It's just a mess of a trait, and I think the game wouldn't lose much from the removal of metal enemies, so I'll place it in D tier. Alien is one of the largest traits in the game due to being added in main story content updates. Introduced in Into the Future, they were later given an expansion in Cats of the Cosmos, which added starred aliens. Alien enemies take on a signature blue shade, with the original ones having a special bump on their body called the Thing, and the starred aliens having a star, space, or technology-related insignia. Alien enemies are well known for two things. The first is abilities, as many alien enemies utilize crowd control or other abilities to try and add to the gameplay experience. Nimoy Boar does knockback, Sail does slow, Moth does freeze, Calamari does weaken, and more. As from generally having a large amount of enemies, the alien trait is diverse with many different options. This large number of enemies can lead to some being obsolete though, like Helmet Krabby and Hypo appearing almost nowhere and doing nothing most of the time. While black enemies are usually more aggressive and fast, aliens are usually slower but have more bulk. The other thing aliens are known for is their crystal mechanic. Without any alien crystal treasure, regular aliens have 7 times the normal strength, and starred aliens have 16 times the normal strength. This makes it so you have to acquire and max out treasures from the respective story mode chapters in order to beat these aliens. While this is a unique mechanic, it really has no reason to exist outside of incentivizing grinding. Alien crystals, especially the ones in Cats of the Cosmos, can also serve as progression blocks, with stages being soft-guarded by having Cats of the Cosmos 2 or 3 magnification aliens, requiring the player to clear the respective Cats of the Cosmos chapter for treasures or risk facing extremely overbuffed alien enemies. A side effect of this is that stages balanced around early Cats of the Cosmos, such as Chapter 1 and 2, turn their alien enemies into absolute jokes once you obtain all the crystals. This way of dealing with stages isn't my favorite, as it just feels unnecessary to have some stages completely destroy you, or the other way around when alien crystals aren't at the correct amount. On the bright side, this mechanic did lead to a new type of challenge run coming into existence called No Crystals, which makes the game harder by doing exactly what it sounds like. Looking specifically at the Cats of the Cosmos expansion, starred aliens also introduced 2 new abilities, being the Warp and the Barrier. Barrier blocks all damage until a certain damage threshold is met, and Warp teleports cat units away and repositions them backwards or forwards. Barrier was a cool idea concept, but quickly became a pretty meaningless ability, as one hit from a barrier breaker unit would remove it and make the ability obsolete. Some barriers like General Gregory have an extremely weak barrier that basically does nothing, while some like Ultra Baba have a high enough barrier that pretty much requires the breaker ability. Warp definitely proved to be the more dynamic ability, and actually made enemies feel unique. Although you could gain immunity with the Warp blocker ability, this mechanic leads to many different types of interactions. You could have extremely long warp durations, like with Wanwan, or even warp enemies forwards like Gardenmeal Bros. Despite this, the ability still isn't as impactful as many other trait abilities introduced later on. But overall, I think that the regular aliens were better implemented than the starred aliens, despite the new abilities added. I'd rank the regular alien trait in S, and the starred alien edition in B tier. Zombie is a trait designed with purple decaying flesh and white bones as their main components. They are an interesting trait, being the first trait to have signature abilities, coming out even before starred aliens. Their two unique abilities are the Burrow and the Revive. Burrow allows them to dig underground upon reaching a unit, and unburrow after moving a certain distance to bypass units. Revive makes it so that when the enemy dies, it turns into a corpse that can't be attacked, and will revive the enemy after a set amount of time. These two abilities allow for zombies to fulfill unique roles that others simply can't, such as diving and assassinating your backliners through the Burrow ability, or by having your units walk over their corpses and then reviving. These abilities aren't too oppressive either, with Burrow being cancelled by any knockback, and Revive being stopped with the Z-kill ability, or simply being countered by moving strong units past the corpse to attack something else. Zombies typically have lower health than most other traits, an aspect that makes sense given their frail designs and revival mechanics. What zombies offer with their class is unique, and it seems they were implemented to counter fragile backliners or unit stacks the player could try to protect. I think zombie enemies in a vacuum are some of the best in the game, but there are a few problems with the trait. The first is a lack of role diversity. There are hardly any zombie support or LD enemies, and the vast majority of them are either peons or medium health frontliners, which all have similar roles. Although even with this considered, there are a good amount of unique zombies, like Lil Zyklone, Big Sal, and Zolo. The other problem, which is the bigger one, is the Holy Blast Cannon. The Holy Blast Cannon, when used, unburrows all burrowed zombies and deals massive damage to them if underground, and less damage if they are above ground. This starts out very low, but at max level, the Holy Blast Cannon is doing 40% of burrowed zombies' max HP and 15% of above ground zombies' max HP. This is a ton of damage, especially when you consider it hits everything on the field, and makes this trait operate entirely differently due to the existence of this cannon. Any sort of big boss enemies this trait could have had will just get nuked extremely hard by the Holy Blast, which in a way limits this trait to being mostly frontline peons or small support. Having an entire trait being countered by just a cat cannon is a big flaw, and although Zombie is still a pretty great trait overall, we'll have to put it in A tier due to this issue, just shy of the best traits in the game. Relic is the trait introduced by Uncanny Legends, with a theme based on their ancient civilization and artifacts, sporting a palette of mostly green and white. Their signature ability is the Curse, which disables all trait targeting abilities that a unit may have. Curse is a very powerful and important ability, able to shut down certain strategies if used right. This allows for more diverse stages and strategies to develop instead of just spamming cookie cutter trait counters. Relic appeared in the game right when it was developing a crowd control centric meta, with new true forms like iCat and Bombercat, as well as Ubers like the Fests dominating the game. Relic enemies are very diverse and can't be categorized into a group, which is one of their best attributes. No Relic enemy behaves quite like another, making them all individually unique and memorable. Despite the low number of total enemies, Relic has a lot of role diversity, from peons to backliners to LD and pushers. Pretty much the only thing this trait is missing is a medium health frontline pusher. Enemies like Sir Rel, Mr. Puffington, and Otham are very well designed enemies that can affect stages in a variety of ways. The most problematic Relic enemies are the ones which are mixed between Relic and Behemoth, which at that point is more of the Behemoth trait's fault than it is Relic's. I think that the biggest problem with Relic though is mostly modern power creep. As more and more Relic power creep came out in the game, like UO Legend True Forms, Ural and Edie's True Form, and even units like Korn and Royal Guard coming out, this trait has gone power crept to the point where it's arguably the new easiest trait in the game when you have endgame units. Despite this, and also because every trait in the game has received massive power creep as well, I think Relics still fulfill their job at making creative stages and are easily one of the best traits in the game. Aku is the newest regular trait added in the game, coming with the Aku Realms expansion, and again with two signature abilities. This trait is characterized with a black and blue color scheme alongside the themes of demons and devils in the designs. Its two signature abilities are the Shield and the Death Surge. Aku shields are similar to Barrier but regenerate after knockbacks, and can be worn down with gradual damage instead of breaking to a single instance of it. Similar to Barrier, this ability blocks crowd control effects while active, and also has a counter ability in Shield Piercer. Death Surge spawns a surge with the same damage and abilities as the enemy upon death, with unique settings for spawn range and surge level. Both of these abilities work well to give enemies more depth, and have been used in different ways to make them all unique. The shield on Fallen Bear is treated very differently from the shield of Midnight D, as is the Death Surge from Sinner Snake and Condemned Pang. Their role seems to be a mix of Zombie and Relic, with shield countering CC like a Relic's curse ability, and Death Surge countering unit stacks or backliners like a zombie enemy would. They can be categorized similar to black enemies in a way, due to being threats that require immediate attention, but the threat of an Aku enemy may not just come from damage due to their unique abilities. In a way, Aku feels like what you'd get if people tried to make the perfect trait, at least on surface level. I made a video a while back comparing the Aku with the Behemoth subtrait, giving praise to Aku's attributes. But as time has gone by, Aku has developed more problems as it continues to grow. Shield, while not as bad as Barrier, has been used in a manner that basically requires you to bring a Shield Piercer, with enemies such as Death Quarry being near invincible without it. Death Surge and just Surge spam in general has become a staple of certain Aku enemies or stages, which basically requires proper counter units instead of allowing for counterplay. Although these conditions aren't in every Aku stage, they happen enough for it to be notable. I would say that Aku is also the least power crept trait in the game right now, but it has received its fair share of creep with the likes of Ural's true form completely dominating the trait. Honestly, it's a very solid trait, but not as flawless as the best, so I'll place it in A tier. Finally, Traitless is the last regular trait I'll talk about, and it's actually the first trait in the game. The doges, snaches, and hippos you fight at the start of the game are all traitless. This trait is categorized by a white color, and a lack of fitting into any of the other main traits. The purpose of Traitless is to be fundamental enemies where you are supposed to counter them based on their regular attributes, like range, damage, health, and more, instead of just bringing a direct trait counter. Although the amount of Traitless targeting units has grown since its inception, it still maintains its identity of being harder than other traits to bring direct counters to. Traitless is a very large trait, especially since it has only kept growing since the release of the game. The trait has no real pattern due to the diversity in the trait, but many of the enemies can harbor similar roles, especially peons and frontline walls. Traitless is a pretty important trait for the game, arguably the most important due to its role as the anti-trait. It's important to teach the player how to respond to enemies regardless of their traits, and you can see this trait succeeding as early as Empire of Cats. Players can learn how range advantages are important, and how you can counter higher range enemies with tanks or rushers. Later traitless enemies like Boar Jr. and Mr. Murr are very unique and make you counter them in special ways. If there was a flaw with this trait, it would be similar to that of Relic, where due to modern power creep it's become too easy to counter them, especially since this goes against the core identity of traitless enemies. But I actually think Traitless did fine into the power creep, and are still traditionally hard enemies to counter in most stages. Sure, the bosses are seeing hell from the very strong single target answers like Taurus and Glass, but the regular enemies still function pretty well besides that. Hitman is the main hard counter to the trait, but he doesn't work well into all of the trait, and is generally not as strong as other respective trait counters like Pizza against Black or Courier against Red. You could say Traitless has too many overlapping enemies, like Douche or Dachshund, but even with as many enemies as Traitless has, it still has tons of diversity within its roles, and tons of unique enemies. It's an important trait for the game, and it works well for its purpose, which is why I'll be placing it at the top of my tier list for the traits. Now moving on to the sub-traits, let's start with the first non-collab one, being Colossus. Colossus enemies typically have a large black gem-like object inside their bodies, and are larger than the regular enemy variant. This sub-trait started out as being unique to Baron bosses, but later was given to common enemies starting from late UL. I think it comes to no one's surprise that Colossus is a failed sub-trait. It simply is a sub-trait that does nothing and doesn't really add much from a gameplay perspective or thematic sense. Colossus enemies don't act differently from normal enemies, the only thing that changes being that the sub-trait allows for the counter ability Colossus Slayer to give units extra stat bonuses against this trait. Colossus Slayer is hardly distributed as an ability, only on a few Ubers and on a few endgame Legend True forms. I think that there really isn't much else to say besides the fact that this trait contributes basically nothing to the game, and every enemy with the Colossus sub-trait would be the exact same if Colossus didn't exist. So as a trait that does absolutely nothing, we'll be placing it at the very bottom in D tier. Behemoth is next, which is a sub-trait that actually did make a difference. Behemoth enemies usually have more fur and scars, alongside being a bit larger than their normal counterparts. This is due to them being a reference to enemies from the Monster Hunter series. The signature of Behemoth enemies is to have immunities to cat unit abilities, as all of them except the Raging Gory have immunities. While some of them do lead to more depth, a lot of them do end up having minimal impact. The counter ability in Behemoth Slayer, however, does have a large impact, and due to stacking multipliers with normal traits, leads to Behemoth enemies usually dying way too fast or way too slowly. Behemoth as a sub-trait came alongside the Behemoth Colon content, an adjacent form of progression that unlocks egg units and showcased more Behemoth enemies. When looking at the enemies the Behemoth trait has, it's a pretty mixed bag. Some of the enemies are pretty cool, like Arient, Kurokroc, and Fulvorian, but others are linear giant stat sticks of enemies that act as unit checks, like Rajakong, Megamajo, and Pickle. While a lot of aspects of Behemoth are pretty rough, I do think that this trait overall was a positive contribution to this game. And as time has gone on since my initial review of the trait, I think that it has aged quite a bit better than anticipated, even if the core problems remain. Behemoth isn't the best, but it's not that bad of a sub-trait, landing a C tier placement. The last sub-trait on this list would have to be the newly added Sage trait, which is a very unique sub-trait. Sage is based on historical figures, with enemies like Dojeinstein being based off of Einstein, and Soroctes being based off of Socrates. Sage's core ability is that they receive 70% less effect from crowd control effects, which can be bypassed with the Sage Slayer ability. This cat ability also grants them a stat bonus, but it's much smaller than Behemoth Slayer. As Sage is a relatively new trait, it's hard to predict how well it will end up in the future. But from what we have now, it's a pretty well balanced sub-trait. I think all of the new regular Sage enemies are pretty fair, and although some might not be the most interesting, this crowd control reduction effect does lead to more interesting strategy while fighting them. While CC reduction can lead to terrible bosses like Soroctes, I do think that regular enemies which are easier to counter can benefit from it to just be a little bit more interesting. Though it's not to say that some enemies like Dr. KO and Diabrolo could pretty much be the same without the Sage sub-trait. Enemies like Dark Dober, Technoid Hyena, and Old Stritch use the crowd control reduction as their core identity, forcing the player to fight them differently. While some can find them annoying, especially Old Stritch, I think that the enemies are pretty cool overall and a nice addition to the game. I'll give them a low B tier, but it could move up or down depending on how this sub-trait ends up developing. While we have finished all the classic traits, there is technically one more secret trait left to discuss, and that would of course be Enemy Base, a trait given to animated bases in stages. This goes in D tier. Regular Doge Base isn't bad, but after Octopus and other wave blockers came out, it has almost no impact on stages. The one exception being Glass Slippers, which is actually a really good stage. Curse Base is a cool concept, but just like Doge Base, gets countered too easily by just luring, negating its core function. And Surge Base is just pure evil. So yeah, there's our results after analyzing and ranking every trait in the Battle Cats. If you enjoyed the video, go subscribe or whatever. Anyways, have a good day, and I'll see you guys in the next one.